Right on time. And what is your name, Sean?
Montague, sir, though the engines at Paddington always called me Duck. They used to say I waddle, sir. No, I really don't, but frankly, I do like Duck better than Montague.
Then Duck it shall be. This is Percy, our current pilot. He'll show you the ropes. Run along now.
Duck is a Great Western Railway Class 5700 pannier tank engine, who arrived on the island of Sodor in 1955, taking over pilot duties at Tidmouth from Percy, and later being reassigned to the Arlesburg branch upon its reopening. He was inspired by a spare engine that Wilbert Awdry used on his model railway. A malformed wheel gave it a distinct waddle, and his children nicknamed it Duck. Duck claims in the stories Gordon Goes Foreign and Cross Lines to have previously worked at Paddington Station in London. The number he wears, however, conflicts with this. Number 5741 was a real engine, but it spent its life in Wales hauling mineral traffic. There are many ways to interpret this conundrum. Neither the island of Sodor or reading between the lines mention Duck having worked at Paddington, but they also state that 5741 might not be the number he originally carried. Perhaps Duck swapped plates with another engine for some reason. Maybe the number is just an artist's mistake that was never resolved. Or perhaps he's just a huge liar. My original headcanon was that he was 5741 and simply led a different life. But since I originally wrote that, Sodor Island Models came out with a video pointing to 5753 as the real Duck. And so now, I'm conflicted on what to do. Either way, this didn't really affect the making of my model of Duck too much, but I'm getting ahead of myself. When I began making my own HO scale locomotives, they were all shells placed onto chassis taken from ready-to-run engines. However, I knew that this would only get me so far. If I wanted truly accurate models, there would come a point where I'd have to start making my own chassis as well. I thus decided that after I had finished Thomas, I would look into creating my own chassis from scratch. While I was on vacation in June 2023, I read a few books about scratch building locomotives, which provided a lot of insight into the process that I desperately needed. I also watched Sam's Trains videos documenting his adventures in 3D printing various steam locomotives in 00, and I think it was these that cemented in my mind that 3D printing could indeed produce an adequate, functioning model locomotive. With how bad I am at cutting things in a straight line, I didn't want to try and saw brass sheets apart while keeping the measurements square and true, or drilling accurately without a mill. So 3D printing seemed like the best route short of a CNC machine or photo etching. At the time, I only had an Elegoo Mars 3, a basic resin printer, but most resins are rather brittle when cured, and are known to shrink slightly and can warp, especially at points where the supports connect. FDM, which uses plastic filament, isn't free of these issues, but I had more confidence in its ability to deliver something sturdy and of accurate dimension. As such, I decided I'd use an FDM printer to make my chassis, and bought an Ender 5 S1. Before I actually made the model, I needed to figure out how the thing was going to work so I could order the parts I need. After some research into gearboxes and seeing what would fit, I settled on this arrangement. A motor drives the rear axle through a high-level kit's Roadrunner Plus gearbox at 45:1 gearing. The drive wheels are Allen Gibson part number 4848G, which is close enough to what the 5700's wheels would be at HO scale, though not exact. I also initially planned to give Duck a sprung center axle using horn blocks from High Level, which evolved into having the front two axles sprung and equalized. Such an arrangement ensures that all the wheels stay on the track, even when going over poorly laid track. However, this project was already very advanced for me, and I decided to have a rigid chassis in the name of simplicity, and use a stay-alive capacitor to ensure consistent running. It also took me quite a while and several prototypes to figure out how to best print the body in a way that would allow me to remove it and service the gearbox. Eventually, I figured out that I could make the bottom part of the firebox into a motor mount, attach it to the chassis, and I could slide the body on with minimal finagling, even with the back head attached. With all this in mind, I went into Blender and got to work. I started doing test prints fairly early on to see how much I'd need to change to make everything fit. Each iteration saw the engine being opened up slightly until I was able to put it together with the gearbox and motor in place, with the changes getting less and less obvious, and then adding details such as the tank filler caps, the dome, the injectors. These were a pain to model. If I ever see another injector again, it'll be too soon. I originally meant for these to be separately fitted, but at the time I was still using my Mars 3, whose print quality is nowhere near up to the level of my current GK2. Couple that with the fact that I was still very, very naive with 3D printing. Even after switching printers though, I kept the injectors and whistle attached to the body for printing, which makes painting them a pain later down the line, but it was easy to not have to fine-tune their fit. And rather embarrassingly, there was also a point where I realized my 3D model was too small because I, A, was using drawings that weren't properly proportioned, and B, had not scaled them properly, even after switching to properly proportioned orthos. Always use multiple measurements to scale your reference material, and not rely on the size of the drivers alone. The frames were printed in PLA and are based on how the real engine's frames are shaped, rather than being a solid block. After reaming the holes on their sides, the brass bushings can be glued into place, although I didn't glue them in until I was certain I had the final print. I also added channels for the pickups later on, and made them thinner so I could gauge the wheels properly. As the months passed, there was still one thing I hadn't figured out. For such a seemingly simple piece, making the side rods was one of the biggest challenges of the whole project. At the time, there were 3 options that I was considering pursuing. One was to cut them out of a piece of sheet metal, either with a jeweler saw or a Dremel. This would require a very steady hand that I wasn't sure I had, especially when drilling holes for the crank pins. The second was to try and cut down rods from another engine, but none of what I had and was willing to use would work. The third were these Allen Gibson universal side rods, which you cut to length and solder into place. However, my attempt to open up the crank pin bosses didn't go so well, and on top of that, they don't really match the curved look of the 5700's rods. I was so uncertain about the side rods that they delayed this project more than anything, and as a result, I missed my goal of having him done for Audrey Extravaganza 4. At that point, I decided to take a step back and focus on some other projects. Eventually, it came to my attention that Micromark offers a photo etching kit. Etching, if done properly, has the potential for high-fidelity results, but this requires the use of acidic chemicals. This particular system laminates the metal with a UV-resistant film, and then it's exposed to UV light with a pattern over it. The pattern blocks the light from areas that you want to etch away. The metal is then stripped of this uncured film, and it is then placed in a tank of ferric chloride, where the remaining bare metal is slowly dissolved. My first few attempts didn't go so well for various reasons, including the metal etching unevenly. This is honestly worth a video of its own explaining the process, and I'll likely do that in conjunction with a future project. After much trial and error, I found the right timing for each step of the process, and sorted out a couple of issues with the manual, and I was presented with a functional pair of side rods. One other thing to note is that I could not use 24 gauge metal as I originally wanted. At least, not with this exact system. The included laminator can only fit metal up to 0.015 inches thick, which is just slightly over 28 gauge. And the manual is written with the idea that you're using even thinner metal than that. I know it's possible to etch thicker metal, but at the moment, I was just happy to have a decent etch at all. I suppose I'll just have to deal with slightly flimsy rods until I can figure something out. All the while, I was continuing to make prototype bodies. It seemed there was always a detail I had forgotten to add, or something didn't fit properly. Oh, there's no lamp irons, there's no sanding levers, I forgot to add this weird pipe thing under the boiler whose shape I can't figure out. All these revisions did elevate his looks significantly compared to the so-called final version from a year prior though. A few little details can go a long way. Speaking of details, I'd like to go over some of the differences between my duck model and the book's illustrations. The books show duck with these odd, extra sandboxes above the running plate. The 5700's actual sandboxes are down here, and are operated via this lever. Where these extra sandboxes came from remains a mystery to this day. In the name of accuracy to the real engine, I have left them off, although that does leave a bit of an odd-looking duck. The second deviation is the inclusion of a top feed, based on this photo of the real 5741. Neither the AccuraScale model, of which I was using orthographic drawings to help my modeling, or 5753 had top feeds, and Duck is never depicted with one in the illustrations. But I imagine that in order to achieve top performance, he would have been fitted with one at some point. Plus, I really prefer this look for the class. Finally, in keeping with the rules of my Northwestern Railway, I've depicted Duck as a dual-braked engine, hence the presence of 2 different brake pipes and a Westinghouse air pump. It took me a while to find a place for this, but I eventually placed it on his rear under the lip of his bunker. That way it's present and accessible for service, but doesn't interfere too much with the look of the engine. The cab and boiler backhead are printed separately to aid in assembly. To attach the body to the chassis, there is a 2mm hole under the smoke box and bunker. A nut is superglued into place inside each, so the bolt can be inserted from the bottom. The front uses a 7mm long bolt, and the rear a 5mm one. Handrails were made from wire and turned brass knobs. I've been using Phoenix Precision short knobs on my previous projects, but I ran out while working on Duck's right side, and I had to use some Allen Gibson ones to finish him. It shouldn't be too noticeable once he's painted though. The main handrail had to be bent to follow the curve of the smoke box, and let me tell ya, this was not easy or fun to do. But it was a little easier this time around though, as I used a brass wire for it rather than the steel music wire I'd used on the Audrey X4 version. Brass is a far more malleable substance than steel is. Finally, it was time for painting. The wheels, backhead, and brake rigging were sprayed with Mr. Hobby black primer. I masked the axles and tires using a mix of tape and blue tack, covering the metal contact surface, flange, and backs as best as I could. It is not a perfect method, but it works. If any overspray occurs, it's easy enough to clean with a wheel cleaner or fiberglass pencil. The shade of green was achieved by using a white primer as the base coat, and applying Tamiya TS6 British Green over that. This combination results in a very solid match for Great Western Green, and a very even coat. Anything not green was painted by hand, including his running board, smoke box, and safety valve bonnet. I realized at this time that I hadn't added the pipes that run along the valences, so I made those with copper wire and glued them on, and then painted over them. A coat of clear gloss allowed me to apply his Great Western lettering, using Fox Transfer's waterslide decals. These are oversized as they are intended for 00 models, but I personally think that at this size, they're close enough that I'm okay with using them. One of the key facets of model railroading is knowing when something is good enough. The same was to go for the number plate, which is an etch also made by Fox, but being as I don't know what number I want Duck to have anymore, I've left that off for the time being. I did consider 3D printing a properly scaled one, but now that I can etch my own metal, I might give that a try. After the decals were on, I sealed everything in with a satin varnish from Vallejo. To weigh the engine down, the tanks are filled with tungsten putty, while the bunker received a moderate amount of liquid gravity, which is actually not a liquid, but a bottle full of very small ball bearings. After these were secured with glue, I dropped it and had to completely remake it in the span of 2 days. I installed a false bottom made from styrene, atop which I'd add his coal load, made from real coal secured with white glue. It's worth noting that on the Audrey X4 prototype, I glued the cab to the body and filled the gap between cab and tank with putty before painting. However, on this version, I've left the cab as a separate unit as I originally wanted to do, to make servicing a little bit easier. Like all my engines, Duck has a DCC decoder. In this case, I've used a TCS KAM4 with an integrated stay alive. The appropriate leads were soldered to the motor and the pickups, and a coating of superglue ensures the pickups are insulated from the motor. The motor mount is glued to the frames, and the motor is glued to the mount for good measure. The crank pins had to be filed down, and I glued the nuts on rather than soldering them for fear of melting the plastic core of the wheel. The cab is finagled into place, and the bolts are inserted. And now, the moment of truth.
Oh man.
He runs. He's jittery and spotty and stiff at times, but he runs. I'm showing the best footage I have of him running, which took some coercion of the model to get. Upon review, it would appear that my decision to make a rigid chassis has come back to bite me, as not all of the wheels like to sit flush on the track as they should. There is also a slight wobble in his motion, which would indicate to me that either a wheel is malformed or not turning on the axis it's intended to. To my knowledge, Allen Gibson uses plastic injection molding to make their wheel centers, and these wheels have probably been in production for a very long time. And if that's the case, then I would suspect that mold degradation might also have a part to play. Still, for a first try at making something like this, I'm amazed that he runs at all. His faces are by Ethan in the Gauge 1 Modelers Discord server. The eyes are just these 5mm ball bearings I use to mix my paints, painted white with black dots for pupils. These are then held in place with a blob of fresh blue tack, and they attach to this piece inserted into the smoke box. The final details to be added were his brake rigging, which I had a whole rant written about, but to keep this video upbeat and pleasant, I'm gonna keep it brief. To summarize, making it fit was a nightmare due to the fact that the mechanism is on the outside of the locomotive rather than between the frames as on most engines that I've seen. It got to the point that I considered leaving these off entirely, but I did manage to make them fit eventually without them rubbing up against the wheels or the rods. As mentioned before, I have not added a number plate yet, and I also still have yet to weather him. Although given that I went overboard with the weathering on most of my other models, I think I'm allowed to have one that's presented in a bit of a fresher condition. I knew this project would take a while, but I didn't think he'd take nearly as long as he did. I thought it would take me around 6 months from start to finish. In actuality, it was more like a year and a half, but I think the results speak to that time. Compare this with what I brought to Audrey Extravaganza 4, and it's night and day. There are definitely some things that I'd do a lot differently if I were to do this over again. For one, I'd print the running board separately from the boiler and tanks. The way I made the 3D model didn't account for this, and it definitely made painting a lot more difficult than it had to be. But do keep in mind that this is only the second steam engine body that I've made. I'd also print the whistle and injectors and maybe a few other components separately, as this printer is way more suited to fine parts than my Mars 3 was. I'd also like to have another go at the chassis and actually compensate it this time, or maybe even just use continuous springy beams. I'd also use a gearbox with slightly lower gearing just to make him work a little bit better as a shunter. I also need to add pipes for steam heating and an air reservoir and push-pull equipment, but then again, I need to add those to everyone else, don't I? All things considered, this turned out way better than I could have hoped. I think I'll take a step back from these more advanced engines for a bit. I'll finish Daisy and then try something that requires a little less mechanical engineering. I had my next steam engine planned to be Emily, to provide a little more challenge, but after taking so long on Duck, I'm not so sure I'm ready for her. I may do another small inside cylinder engine, but that's dependent on if I can acquire appropriate wheels in a timely manner. Allen Gibson and Markets don't have online stores, making ordering from them as a foreigner a pain in the bunker, and Ultrascale appears to be on a hiatus, so no custom-sized tires. In an ideal world, I'd have my own means of making these vital components, but such is life. In the meantime, I'll look into getting this man some auto coaches. Perhaps then he'll be a little more cooperative. Until next time, friends, remember, it's the Great Western Way or the wrong way.